start. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Australian Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that today's event is being held on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of the country for thousands of years. And we would like to pay our respect to First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge the attendance of special guests, the Councillor for Education from Chinese Consulate General in Sydney, Ms. Lin Xiaoqing, and also her colleague, Council for Education, Ms. Li Xiaojun, and also the chair of the Foundation for Australian Studies in China, FASIC, Kevin Hopgood-Brown, AM, and Jocelyn is not here yet, but she will soon be here. Jocelyn is the founding director and adjunct professor of this institute. And also we have Emeritus Professor of School of Communication and Humanities and Communication Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University, Professor Peter Hutchins. And we also have Professor Megoli from the University of Sydney, and a filmmaker, and James Berkeley, and many other distinguished guests. Welcome to my China Story conversation series. The aim of this series is to broaden and deepen our understanding of a multifaceted China through sharing lived experiences by public figures of Australians who have lived and worked in China. Today we are very honored and privileged to have Professor David Goodman as our speaker, who will use photographs, and then we will have a book. If you haven't, you can take a copy of it. This photograph book is vital, that he took all these photos in China to tell my China story. We will first hear Professor Goodman's presentation, followed by my conversation with David, and then at the conclusion of the conversation, we will have a short presentation and demonstration of Chinese music appreciation number 4, and this time is from Huqin to Hulusi by our postdoc research fellow, Dr. Nicholas Ng, who will do the presentation. I believe many of you know or know of Professor David Goodman, and if you don't, you will soon too. And at the very start, Professor Goodman asked not to have an introduction, and because he would like to do self-introduction. So I said, of course. Only later I realized he was serious. So please welcome Professor David Goodman to present his My China Story, Photographs, Popular Culture, Personal Experiences.
Thank you. Thank you, Jing, and thank you all, everybody, for coming tonight. I'm currently the Director of China Studies at the University of Sydney. I've been working in universities teaching Chinese politics and society since a week before Lin Biao was killed in a plane crash over Mongolia in 1971. And my research has been on social and political change in China. So, of course, I've spent a lot of time in China, willy-nilly. And I thought what I would do is tell you a bit about the time I've spent there, using photographs, as Jing says, and referring to popular culture if I can. And let's hope this works. No, I switched it off, that's all. Okay, get it right? Yeah. Okay. We originally, when we talked about this originally, Jing and I planned to have a photo exhibition. Of course, that rapidly became impossible because, of course, producing photos is really very mafan. I decided instead to let you all have copies of this photo. If you haven't got one, please take one. As Jean said, they're all my photos. They're essentially people, photographs of people and everyday life in the period that I've spent in China, which so far is 1976 to 2021. But who knows how much longer it will go on. I'm going back to China next Tuesday, and you never know what's going to happen after that. This picture here is actually very important to me. This is taking Chairman Mao for a walk, obviously, but the very first day when I was in Beijing, or the very first morning when I was in Beijing, the very first time I went to China, I came out of the hotel, the Beijing hotel, and they were doing this in Chang'an in the road. And I thought, what on earth is going on here? Well, in case you don't know, to cut a long story short, it's a picture of the demonstrations against Deng Xiaoping, because I arrived in April of 1976 when Deng Xiaoping was blamed for the demonstrations that had earlier occurred a couple of days before in Tiananmen Square. And what happened was that people marching along the road saying, "Down with the dangerous rightist Deng Xiaoping, and long live Chairman Mao," who of course is the character in the photograph. And this kind of fascinated me really. And although I'd been teaching Chinese politics for about 5 years beforehand, my engagement with China before this moment was largely intellectual. I wouldn't say that my engagement with China after this was emotional, but it was certainly much more committed and more intrigued than it had been at that point. So this photo means a lot to me. I'm going to tell you a bit about the places I've lived, largely, but also the places I've visited. If you don't know where these places are, you can be forgiven. I think most of you looking around, I think you probably know where they are. But I've lived a fair bit in Shanxi. I've lived most recently in Suzhou, which is around here somewhere. I lost it. And then I've spent a lot of time, as you've seen, in the west of China. I've been to other places too, and undoubtedly I may say a few things about that, but not necessarily. So that's really where we're going. I'm really fascinated by photography. I mean, I always tell people when I was young I wanted to be a photographer, but soon realised I would earn less money than being an academic. So I decided to be an academic instead. What I'm going to do though a lot of the time is show you where I'm able, pictures as it was when I was first there in the 70s, and pictures as it was 30 or 40 years later. And this is a good example. On that first trip to China, I went on that first trip to China as part of a delegation, and we were invited by the Chinese People's Association for Relations with foreign countries. And we went to all the places that delegations in those days went to. So this is Beijing, this is Jinshan at the back of the Imperial Palace. And then, of course, we went to the Great Wall, Badaling. These are 3 different pictures of Badaling. I wouldn't want you to think I was there in 1928. I did some work. I don't really want to talk about my research, but I did some work on a German architect who lived in Qingdao, Tianjin, and Beijing, and Taiyuan from 1904 to 1936. Once he realised the Japanese were coming, he got out. That's another long story. Anyhow, the 26th picture is from his archive, which I, by accident, inherited. The other 2 pictures are by me. I love the contrast between the emptiness of 1976 and the fullness of 2000. We also went to Nanjing, you know, the only place in China at that time where you could take pictures of bridges or trains. You'll see here that there's a man standing up. We were so lucky. 30 years later, he sent his son to stand in the same place. Just in case you think I'm not joking, I am. But this is also Nanjing. So we were allowed to take, the only place in China we were allowed to take pictures of trains. And this is a train on Nanjing. The contrast, of course, is not on Nanjing. It's not on the bridge, the second picture. It's the more recent train. It's actually at Nanjing Station, so there you go. And this is quite fascinating. This was in Shanghai, Songjiang in Shanghai, on the black and white in 76. and the other picture 30 odd years later. They built on that site. All these pictures, by the way, are almost coordinate for coordinate, taken in the same place. The Shanghai, they built something called Thames Town, a model village based on English, taken from photos largely. I mean, one of the things they built was a pub that's very famous in Whitby, but it was in Thames Town, and so on and so on. They built a copy of the Albert Bridge there too, which was a bit strange, but there you go. So I went to China in '76, and as I say, it changed my commitment to China in lots of ways. And I realized I had to go and live in China. I had to be, my students were going, so I had to go. So I became a student. And I went and I studied in China at first at the Languages Institute and then at Beida. I did economics. Actually, it was Malia Jui, Zhangzhe Jingji Keshui. So it was Marxism, Leninism, but it was called economics. And it was very good fun. So this is as it was in 1978 in Tiananmen Square and down the side of the Goodman, the Imperial Palace. This was, of course, something that happened whilst I was there. Democracy Walls started towards the end of 1978, where people came and put up big character posters there. This is a picture about 30 years later, taken in from exactly the same angle. The Democracy Wall disappeared. And this is from Shanghai. Again, this is 79 on the left, February 79 in Shanghai, looking over towards Garden Bridge, and then Pudong is behind, but nobody built there. And then going back 30 years later, and it changed a bit, at least behind it, not the bridge. I spent a lot of time in Chengdu, both in 78 and 79, because my thesis, which I was still working on part-time at the time, was about Sichuan province, Chengdu being the capital, Sichuan. And so I went down there a lot. On one occasion, in 79, I'm going down, and I was with two fellow students from Beida, Peking University, and they were telling me, this was the start of my interview career in China, they were telling me all kinds of things about what they did and where they came from. I thought, oh, this is fascinating. So I didn't want to take notes in front of them. So I kept going to the toilet and taking notes. And on about the third occasion I'm coming back, I heard one of the students, two females, one say to the other, you know, these foreigners, they have very weak bladders. The other one goes, oh yes, yes. It's one of those things. It's a nice story, it's true. But what I like about Chengdu then, of course you don't see it now, are these kinds of houses. They were a bit like Tudor houses in construction. Large empty rooms at the bottom, timber and mud walls, and people lived upstairs. And all the shops were like that. This is the centre of Chengdu on the right this time in 79, and this is 30 years later here. Again, I tried to match up the people on bicycles, but of course it's an e-bike the second time. And then this is Chongqing in exactly the same way. So this was how it used to look, and this is standing, I promise you, in the same spot is how it looks now, which is quite remarkable. Actually, this was, I think, closer to 40 years later, but there you go. Now, in the 80s, I spent a lot of time coming and going to China. Before I moved to Australia, one of the reasons I moved to Australia was because going and coming from China was easier from here rather than from there, from the UK where I was teaching. And so I went to a few places. This is what Jinyu Hutung, goldfish Hutung, looked like even in the early 80s. And this is what it looks like now. This is in the 80s when we were students, or even before, in the 70s when I was students, down that lane, round about where that car was, on the right was a French hotel, which had, from the colonial era, where all the young, trendy, go-ahead young men who wanted to talk politics gathered. So I was very fond of that place. And it had an octagonal dining room, which was really quite splendid. The food wasn't bad either. But, so that's what it looks like now. And one of the places, of course, I went to through the 80s was Chengdu. I continued to go to Chengdu. This is Leshan, the big Buddha at Leshan in 82 and later on. Here you can see they're playing almost, picture's not come out, they're playing chess. There was nobody else there. 30 years later, it's crowded queues trying to get down the side of the Buddha. Very interesting. Towards the end of the 80s, I started going to Taiyuan. This, as you will all know, is the Catholic cathedral in the centre of Taiyuan. You can tell it's a Catholic cathedral. It's got all the things about it that make it a Catholic cathedral. What you don't know is that it's on the spot where in 1901 there was the largest, 1900, July 9th of July 1900, the largest massacre of Christians, so the Catholic Church tells us, in the history of the Church, up until that point and presumably afterwards. What they mean by that is that 300 foreign missionaries, Catholics, were killed. They forget to tell you about the 7,000 Chinese who were buried there as well. The money for this came from the Boxer Reparations Fund, because this is why there was a massacre there, the reparations. The church itself is quite interesting. You can imagine I've got pictures all over the place of all kinds of people, including the bishop at this place, or various bishops at various times. But this looks like a regular church, doesn't it? Remember, all is not what it seems. This is made largely out of paper mache. What looks like marble is paper painted to look like marble, not really marble at all. Very fascinating place. It's still active, isn't it? Yeah. The other thing that the Boxer Reparations built, was Shanxi University. Does it look like an Oxford College? Yes. Why does it look like an Oxford College? It's meant to. Shanxi University, there was a famous missionary, Timothy Richards, who, as luck would have it, he was based in Taiyuan, but he wasn't there at the time of the Boxer uprising. He'd gone on holiday. So he missed the massacre. Later on, of course, he came back and he was asked by the Qing to look after various things. He was a minister of the Qing for higher education at one point in the Reform era. And the Qing Reform era I'm talking about, not 1978. And he was asked to look after the new university, which would be funded from the reparations fund. So, of course, they decided to build an Oxford type, Western education. And so they built the college on the right. But he was a sensible man. And he spoke Chinese, he knew a lot about China, and he was sensible. And he said, let's not be too, I didn't quite use these words because I'm sure the language wasn't there, but this is what he meant. Let's not be too colonial about this. We're in China. We're going to bring Western education, but Chinese education is also important. So he didn't establish one college, he established two, a Chinese college and a Western college. The one on the left is the Chinese college. The one on the right is the Western college. They're both, unfortunately, the one on the left has subsequently been pulled down. But the one on the right still exists, and of course they're the foundation of the current Shanxi University. Shanxi is also famous. Oh, did I say why I was going to Shanxi? No, I should explain this. Excuse me, I'm rushing too much. I had set up an exchange before, during the 80s, having come back from China, living in China. I'd come back to Newcastle and set up an exchange for our students to go and study in China. They went to Beishida, Peking Normal University. But then the Americans started coming in the early 80s, and the people at Peking Normal University decided they weren't making enough money out of Brits, or British universities. So I thought, I better find somewhere else to go. I visited, I forget what year I visited, but I got the bum's rush from Beishida. So I decided I better find somewhere. So I went back to Newcastle, where I was living, Newcastle upon Tyne, that is. And I said to the people, any ideas in the university? Nobody in the university had an idea. And then I had a brainwave. I thought, where is a coal town in China? Because Newcastle is coal mining, in England. And the answer, of course, is Taiyuan. Taiyuan has coal like other people get up in the morning. You get coal everywhere, not so much now, but certainly then. So I went to the local authority in Newcastle and I said, why don't we twin with Newcastle? And they said, what a good idea. And whilst you're at it, you could start an exchange. So we did. And I soon found that Taiyuan was famous, not just for the massacre, and for the Shanxi University, but also for a couple of other things. One of which was it had the most amazing warlord during the period from the end of the Qing onwards until the end of the Republican era, Yan Xishan, who was really quite an amazing modernizer. He was a bit of a Confucian. He was very pro-Japanese, which was very interesting during the equivalent of the Second World War, because clearly at various times he thought about throwing his lot in, not with the communists or the nationalists, but with the Japanese. But nonetheless, he was an amazing modernizer, and he built all kinds of factories and airports and all kinds of things in Shanxi, including they set up the first airline, domestic airline within China, with a German company. They flew regularly from Beijing to Taiyuan and even back. They had automobile works, they had gas works, they had all kinds of things. And in fact, at one point, they had, the old town of Taiyuan had, most of it had pumped everywhere hot water, especially useful in the winter. Taiyuan's quite far north and very cold, and so that was really good. Anyhow, the bridge on the left is a bridge he built in 1926 over the Fun River. At that time, and when I visited it first, there was, the river used to be a mile wide, but coal mining uses up water, so the river shrunk, and in fact it shrunk even worse than this in the end, and there was nothing on the other side of the river. What happened in the 1990s was that the bridge was pulled down, another very good bridge was built, but also motorways were built along each side of the road. But wait, there's more. Because in addition to the motorway, the riverbed had completely dried up, or almost completely. It was a trickle. And so what they did was they diverted the Yellow River into the centre of along the Funho Basin. The river's called the Funho. And what you see there as water is actually an ornamental lake. Very interesting. The other side is the development that happened later. In fact, who is it? Bojiue is a native of the other side of the river, if any of you know his work. The other thing that Shanxi is famous for is, of course, the Eighth Route Army and the amazing resistance to Japan. Amazing because there weren't many Japanese actually to resist. But they built the post-49 era of communism in China in this area, particularly in the southeast and the northeast of Shanxi. Madian, which you can see there, is where Deng Xiaoping lived, in the Taihang Mountains from 1938 to the end of the war, to 1945. One of the most beautiful places in that Taihang Mountain. This here is the house of Li Shunda. Any of you who know stories from China, from the Cultural Revolution, will remember the stories about Li Shunda. All of this is in southeast Shanxi. Li Cheng is in southeast Shanxi. I'm very fond of Li Cheng for a whole range of reasons, not least of which because I was very lucky. I got given at one point some documents about an uprising that happened there in 1941. A woman's revolt against the Communist Party. Didn't matter who it was against the government. I mean, there wasn't really anybody else there. But what was really interesting was why the women were revolting. And the answer, of course, was because wealthy women in this area, this was not a poor area. I mean, it wasn't a very wealthy area, but it was not a really dirt poor area. And the women, once the communist regime got established, the women were forced to stay at home. And so they went bananas. And they combined with one of the secret societies, and they had an uprising. So I was visited a few times in Lichang. One of my favourite stories happened in Lichang town, which is a bit of a way from it. Here is where the uprising was. Actually on that spot, which is why I took the picture of the peasant who's looking at me thinking, what the God's he doing with the camera? Makes a change. Sometimes with cameras in the early 90s in North China, I would have people coming up to me and go, oh, Yang Guizi, or shooting at me. Anyhow, Lichang County Town is amazing. One morning I was there, early spring. The mist was coming up the valley. It was beautiful. So I thought I'd go for a walk. And the guy I was with, who came from Jiaochan, which is about 2 counties over, who spoke the most incomprehensible Putonghua, because he was from Jiaochan, of course, like Hua. He also decided to come out at the same time, so we went for a walk together. We were walking down the street, and this old peasant comes up to me. And he looks at me, he looks at my friend, and he says, is he Japanese? No, it's from Jiaochan, there's only a couple of counties. I said, no, I don't understand a word he says. What that taught me, as I'm sure most of you know, is that languages are very specific in China, even in North China. People do not speak one language from one place to the next. And it's really quite amazing. I mean, Shanxi is one thing, county to county, that's fine. In Suzhou, where I went to live, within a very small area, within the moat, what they call the moat, it's not a moat, we'll come on to that later, but in that area, people don't, from the north of the city, old city, don't understand people from the south of the old city, which is, about half a kilometre. Well, not quite, maybe a mile. But it's, anyhow, good. More pictures of Shanxi, just so that you know what you're dealing with. So, down the right there, you can see the gasworks that Yan Xishan started. In the top left, that's a church. That's an old Unitarian church. How does that happen? Well, in the 19th century, the North China Inland Mission was established in Taiyuan. All the Protestants from Canada, all the missionaries from Canada, Australia and the UK gathered in Taiyuan. This was the Unitarian Church, the Zhangxie, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, used to meet in the old Baptist Church where Timothy West was, and so on and so forth. There were a whole range of them in the same compound, actually. This one, unfortunately, has now come down, which is why I'm quite fond of it, of course. On the right there, that's Baizhou, only they don't call it Baizhou in Shanxi, it's Fanzhou, named after the river, the Fanhe, and it's not made out of rice, it's made out of millet and smoked sorghum. Smoked millet and sorghum, yeah. So very interesting. And down here is a woman in a cave house. There are 3 types of cave houses in Shanxi. Down in a pit like this, into the side of a wall like this, and one where they build a mountain and then they put the house in. It's really quite interesting. The construction of cave houses is very Shanxi. 2 more pictures of Shanxi. Popular culture. On the left, something else that Shanxi is very famous for, vinegar. Anywhere you go in China, the vinegar was originally from people, the production of vinegar, the process, is from people from this part, from near, what's it called? Yutsu. Near Yutsu. Qinshu, sorry, I'm getting confused. From Qinshu, which is just south of Taiyuan. And they went out everywhere. They went to East China, they went to South China. So this is called Laochan Su, which is the famous Shanxi vinegar. You can buy it it's very cheap, you can get it in all the supermarkets. All the agricultural goods in Shanxi, and indeed mostly in China, are now no longer subsidized. But vinegar is still subsidized in Shanxi. Why? Because Shanxi people drink something like 19 liters of vinegar each, man, woman, child and dog, a year. It's enough to drown in. And it often is, of course. On the right is another famous part of Shanxi. Have you seen the film Raise the Red Lantern?
Yes.
It was filmed here in Shijiazhuang. That's where it was filmed. Yeah. Okay, and two last pictures, I think, of Shanxi. You probably don't associate castles with China, but they do. In the south of Shanxi, the pirates used to come up from the Yellow River and attack the locals. And so they built castles along the river to protect themselves. And this is one that's being reconstructed. I forget when, it's a few years ago now, but it probably doesn't look like that anymore, probably much finished. And on the right is persimmons, which are very much part of Taihan, the Taihan mountain culture. But you can see they've been pressed, so they're kind of artistic. All right, so that was Taiyuan in the 1990s for the most part. Towards the end of the 1990s, I started to go out west. Why? I'm not sure really. I just thought, you know, I've been to Sichuan a lot, and that's quite far west. But the northwest is something completely different. And indeed, beyond Chengdu, Sichuan is quite like this too. An amazing place. So a couple of pictures. This is the back end of the Himalayas on the left, in Qinghai. And the one on the right is also in Qinghai, but it's in Shunhua. It's what's it called? In Shunhua. Did I say Shunhua? Yeah. Qinghai, Shunhua County, which is a Sala nationality area, a street market. And so's the mosque. Oh yeah. So I started interviewing people in China around about entrepreneurs in China around about 1991. I've interviewed something like just under 10,500 now. Yeah, the files are good. Anybody wants to borrow them? Quite happy to do that. There's a price, of course. But no matter. Anyhow, this is a nice man in a nice entrepreneur. He's the guy in Shunhua who started Shunhua's economic revival. It used to be dirt poor area, dirt poor. And he said, you know, let's start making cashmere for the Italian market, getting wool and so on. And they do. They produce wool, they do all kinds of things, which was very interesting in itself. But then he says to me as we're talking, I love your country, he said. I was Australian by then. He said, I love your country. The Alps, the music by Mozart, the chocolate. So for those of you who don't speak Chinese, Australia is Ao Da Li Ya, and Austria is Ao Da Li. So he got the two confused. What a surprise. Now, moving on to back into the situation of, is this what we really think? I often show these pictures to people. I had them on my wall at various offices at various times, and people come and say, where's that? And I say to them, where do you think it is? And they say, South Germany, which of course is almost correct, because it's the German colony of Qingdao on the northeast coast. It's really quite an amazing place, and you would think you were in Germany without any doubt from the architecture, and it's well worth going to visit for that reason. I met another entrepreneur there. You were there, weren't you? Yeah. So this was really amazing. So he was a larger than life entrepreneur. We're having lunch. He gave us lunch. I mean, when I interview entrepreneurs, it's always the same process. You have 2 hours asking them questions, they asking you questions, and then you have a meal with them. Mornings, afternoons. You get 2 interviews in a day, right? So we're in Qingdao. We're doing these interviews, and he takes us for lunch in his club, right? That he has for his company. It's Shanxi, double star. Over lunch, he says to me, I'm sitting next to him, he says to me, foreigner, Lao Wai, what do you believe in? I said, not much. He said, no, what religion do you believe in? Are you a Catholic? Are you a Protestant? I said, not really anything, you know. Grew up in a communist household. Used to be Jewish, I suppose it was. Oh, no. He said, come with me. Let me show, I'm a Buddhist. Come with me. Let me show you what I believe in. Don't you think, and he led us outside and he showed us the Buddha. And he said, don't you think that looks like me? I'm bigger than Jesus. He actually said to us, I'm bigger than Jesus Christ. I'm bigger than any of these. He was an amazing fellow. Usually, by the way, people don't allow me, I don't push it. And I say to people when I'm doing the interviews, these are all, I'm not going to name your names, but these two, both of them, bigger than life, say, oh, yes, of course you must say who I am. Back to Taiyuan, back to Shanxi. Some interesting pictures from there. Again, same period, but Jesus comes up again, as you can see here. This is a church in Hongtong. Those of you who know Chinese culture will have heard the story about Suzhou and Hongtong Meo Iga Haran, that kind of stuff. But this is also a church that's in Hongtong. A large part of southeast Shanxi has a lot of Christians in it. Very few non-Chinese people, non-Han people, but lots of Christians. This is, the middle picture is the Shandang Gate in Changzhou. Changzhou is one of my favourite places in the whole of southeast Shanxi. Not least because it was the only city that the Communist Party ever controlled before they came to power in 1949. And they did from 1937 to 1939. This gate here predates that, of course. The Empress Dowager Cixi, whose name we're not allowed to mention without booing, was born just on the left and grew up just on the left of that gate. And on the right, this is not an old picture. This is about 10 years old, this picture of the platform and so on. But they're still very keen on Mao Zedong and all that stuff in Changzhou. I once thought about buying a flat there, quite seriously, and somebody who's in the audience, who I will not name, but their mother tried to help me buy a flat there. We didn't do it. It would have been silly, because, you know, nice as southeast Shanxi is, you don't want to be tied to having a holiday home in southeast Shanxi. Okay, so going back to the west of China. If you know where these places are, you're better than I am. Because I show this picture to people and they say, oh, where is that in China? I say, have a guess. And they say, as you might be thinking to yourself, oh, south of Shanghai, near Ningbo, something like that. No, this is Lanzhou. Lanzhou, you know, only something like, how many thousand kilometers from the sea? On the Yellow River. Very interesting. I have spent a lot of time there and thought that. On the right is really also interesting. Do you know there are pyramids in China? Yes, there are. Xishaling, just outside Yinchuan, the capital of Ningxia. And those are pyramids. Of course, they got worn down by the erosion, but they are pyramids. And they're very like, in many ways, they're very like, they've got figurines and decorations, very like the Mexican pyramids, which really goes to show that the Scientologists are correct. This picture at the bottom is Zhoujiago, northwest Sichuan. Really an amazing waterfall. I heard the other day from somebody that there's been an earthquake in Zhoujiago, and at least some of the waterfalls have closed down. I don't know if this is the big one, but I don't know if it's closed. And then, again, elsewhere in the west is Dunhuang on the right, the famous singing dune. It's great. Only takes you 2.5 hours to walk up and 20 minutes to slide down. I've done it a few times. I've really enjoyed it. But I went there once from Goldman. Do you know where Goldman? Goldman is in Qinghai. Dunhuang is technically in Gansu, though parts of it are also, for reasons we won't go into, also in Qinghai. And I went on a bus. I tried to buy a ticket for the bus. And the bus ticket seller said, no, you can't do it. You need a visa. Oh. And in any case, they said, foreigners are not allowed. So I went off to see a friend of mine who was a Tibetan Mongolian policewoman who works in Goldman, just by chance. One of those people you pick up along the way. You're at university with them, and so they become useful later. And I said to her, can I have a visa? She said, you're Chinese, aren't you? I said, yes. So she gave me a visa. So we went to, contrary to what some people tell me, I'm not Chinese, but I know it's not true. I went to get on the bus. And I said to the bus driver, look, I've had to get a visa. Why do we have to have visas? bus driver goes, that's very interesting. I don't know, he said. It could be because of the secret army base over there, or the secret airport over there, or the oil field over there. He said, but people have to have visas. And that's what happens. So we've got on the bus, we go up to this is 4,000 something meters above sea level. This is the plateau at the top. All there is, as you can see on the left, is a concrete toilet block. It's very windswept. There's nothing to see. You can't even see Secret Army anything. And then you carry on going on to it. But it was fascinating. More fascinating was the fact that we got stopped on the way by the Snow Leopard Patrol. It was an anniversary of 9/11. I forget which year it was exactly. But it was on the 11th of September. And they were hassling all the Muslims on the trip. They came up to check visas and so on. They came up, saw me, and they went, no problem, and went on. I think I look more Muslim than Chinese, actually. So elsewhere in West China, there's a corridor that goes up from Lanzhou all the way out into the Inner Asia, which is the route into China historically. It's called the Herxi-Lungda. What's that in English? I don't know. The Herxi-Lungda, anyhow. In the middle of which is a fantastic town called Jianye. It's really great. The picture on the left is the Shanxi Huiguan. The Shanxi, what would you call a Huiguan? A hotel. The Shanxi had a tradition of merchants who travelled all over China. And they set up these kind of hotels, Huiguan, sort of guild. They call them guilds, don't they, Huiguans? But it's not like, anyhow, that's the Shanxi Huiguan in Jianye. The guys on the right are really interesting, or rather they're not interesting, but they allow me to tell you a story. So Jianye is on the way to the middle of nowhere. It's a great place, but it has all kinds of wonderful things, including Tibetan monasteries, a fantastic pit, which is many-coloured and so on and so forth. So I went there for that reason, and I went into this hotel, and I tried to pay with a credit card. No, they wouldn't take a credit. So they said, you have to pay cash. Oh. So where's the ATM? Yeah, it's out there. So I go out to find the ATM, and I found it. I took out, it had a door, there's a bank with a classic Western ATM, little bank, with the door, glass door, shut. So I get out my card, and I swipe it. No click. Tried it with other cards, no click. These guys were standing there, or sitting there. So I said to them, is there another ATM somewhere? I can't seem to get in here. And they said, well, there's no other ATM close by, but let me show you. And one of them comes over and pushes the door. It wasn't even locked. Oh, and if we're talking about Jianye, I might as well talk about the Great Wall. One of the myths, as you all know, of all time, is that you can see the Great Wall from space. It's bullshit. Sometimes in China, you can't even see the Great Wall when you stand next to it. This here is the Great Wall in the corridor. What is the Great Wall in this part of China? And for most of it, it's a communication corridor. It's where people walk. Where it's flat, as opposed to, Mutianyu and Ningwu and so on. In those places, it was a kind of full, but really it was a communications device. It was a communications corridor. And people moved along it. And in the Herxi-Lungda, it really is, it's a line of communication. So much so that that there you've got the old wall line, you've got a road next to it, you've got the old railway line next to it, and now they've got the high-speed railway line next to it as well. So they're all there in the same location. But these are some good pictures. One of the things you probably don't know, though, this is Ningxia, the Great Wall. This is the Herxi-Lungda. That's Ningwu. Oh, Ningwu. Shanxi, of course, has two Great Walls. It would do. One in the north and one in the middle. This is a total reconstruction at Taiyuan, which is now said to be the end of the wall. Of course it isn't. The wall goes for another 1,000 kilometres past Dunhuang into Xinjiang in the desert, which is what those two last pictures are. So round about 2013, have I got time? Yeah. Round about 2013, I ended up being asked to go to Suzhou by a friend of mine who was then the provost, vice president academic for a joint venture university in Suzhou. I'd known him, he was a geographer, and I'd known him years ago in the UK. And he said, come and set up a Department of China Studies because we want to encourage international students to come on. That's how it happened. Anyhow, I went. This is the famous Watergate of Shanxi on Suzhou, and that's the alleyway where I lived in the centre of Suzhou. I mean, it looks a bit run down. Well, of course, things do look a bit run down from the outside, but in typical Chinese way. Inside was amazing, and my house was too, that's my house just down there, 2-story house. I'm going to tell you a bit about Suzhou in a minute, but first I just want to tell you one of the things that I did when I was in Suzhou. I took students regularly to two places in China, Xi'an and Chengdu, obviously. Foreign students, but some Chinese students too. You know the terracotta warriors, and you know the wall that goes, everybody knows the wall that goes around Xi'an is really very famous. But more interesting than that is the bazaar, which is on the left. This is a picture from the bazaar, near in the Hui Quarter, near the Gulong. And then the other thing I really like in Xi'an is not the provincial museum, but the city museum, Xi'an City, which is easily, in my humble opinion, I'll be corrected by the consul, but it's easily the best museum in the whole of China. This is a sarcophagus of a Sogdian. Do you know who the Sogdians were? No. Some of you do, some of you don't. The Sogdians on the left were the traders on the Silk Road. They were a kind of, well, nobody knows really what their religion was. It had all kinds of elements. And it was Manichaean, and it was fire dancing, and it was all kinds of things. But they had those sarcophaguses, or sarcophagi, whatever the plural is, like that. This is a picture, this is a model from that museum, as is the one on the left, which is more classical Chinese, a horse person from the Tang dynasty. There's a lot of Tang stuff in Xi'an, as you probably know. Xi'an is also famous, for me at least, for something that happened in the early 70s. The pictures on the left are Huxian pictures from the early 1970s. I always loved those pictures. I had over the years, I've had posters of them on my office walls, on my home walls and so on. So, luck would have it, in the bazaar in Xi'an, I met the man who had created the whole Huxian peasant artist movement. He was selling pictures and showing people how to do art. He wasn't an oil or a colour painter like this, he was actually a woodblock artist. But he was the one who went from the Institute for Art in Beijing at the start of the Cultural Revolution, went back to his hometown just outside Xi'an and started this peasant art movement. And they're very nice pictures. I always lusted after having one of these pictures for my own, and he sold me one, the one on the right. I don't have it at home. It's the nature of the paint and the nature of the paper meant it was too difficult to bring it back. So it's on the wall in the Department of China Studies at the university that I set up, which is very nice, but it's a nice picture. The other place I took people from, students from Suzhou was Chengdu, and there are two head reasons for going there. One is the Leshan Buddha again, which is quite amazing, and the other is the Shanxi, the prehistoric pit site to the north of Chengdu, which is really quite amazing. I mean, this is just one example of a whole series of masks, which again makes you think the Scientologists might have something going for them. I did, of course, go back occasionally to Taiyuan. This is a picture on the left taken by the architect I was telling you about from the 1920s. and then I tried to position myself to take the same picture, but a bit later, in 2015. And then let me tell you a bit about Suzhou, just to finish off. Suzhou is famous for its gardens, it's famous for its tea, and it's famous for its silk. But I want to tell you about a few other things it should be famous for. Old Suzhou, the old city of Suzhou, is surrounded by water. They call it, in English, a moat. It's not really. It's a canal. The Grand Canal goes from Hangzhou through Suzhou, up to Beijing, actually, through a whole series of lakes, and so it crosses the Yangtze River at one point. It's an amazing, probably starts in the late 6th, but it certainly was built between the 6th and the 9th. And it's quite fantastic. The portion around Suzhou is really what made Suzhou wealthy. Suzhou is phenomenally wealthy historically and even now. GDP per capita in Suzhou, in the greater city, is higher by a long way than the UK. So GDP per capita, not total GDP, but per capita. So, I know there's only 14.5 million people who live in Suzhou compared to 60 million in the UK, but nonetheless it's a good comparison. It's a very wealthy area, and one of the reasons is they built canals, not just the big canal, but they built little canals off it as well. Sometimes people in Suzhou say, yes, we're the Venice of the East, and I really annoy them. I say, what bullshit is that? You had canals in the 7th century. Venice only built them in the 14th century. They don't understand it. You've got to be careful with cross-cultural jokes. Anyhow, these are some of the canal going around the city as the gates. Until 1926, there were no roads across this canal into the old city. No roads. So you lived in Suzhou, you lived on a cobblestone alleyway, like I showed you before, and you were carried, if you were rich, you were carried in a sedan, and you came across the canal by ferry. That's how you got there. All the gates are water gates. There was one bridge in case that was fortified in case of attack, but only one bridge, only one land bridge, and certainly not for vehicles. It was a pedestrian. Very nice. The other thing that I think Suzhou should be famous for, and is its art school. One of the major art schools of Republican China. People went to France, they learned impressionist techniques and so on, and they came back. And what they did was, they adopted the old tropes, the scholar sitting by a river, drinking tea, reading poetry, and they painted them anew. And so there's some examples of that. Less famous is that, but made me laugh at the time. I lived very close to Shuchuanjie, behind one of the gates, for about 1,000 years, Suzhou had a red light district, still does. And along this little part of Shuchuanjie, there were girly bars. In 2018, the police decided they were going to crack down on the girly bars. So they all became coffee shops or tea shops. When this started to happen, I was riding home from work one day, because I used to cycle my bike here. And I was stopping and taking pictures, and this nice old lady came up to me and said, it's not really a tea shop. And I said, oh, really, what is it? She said, I can't tell you. The other thing that Suzhou really should be famous for is its mushrooms. Mushrooms to die for. Whilst I lived there, I used to make a pile of mushroom casserole every weekend, which would do me for evening meals. The mushrooms are just amazing, so tasty, so varied, and so on. Okay, so I'll come back and finish off Suzhou in a minute, but just let me tell you a story from London. I wasn't going to tell, I was thinking, and I was talking to Ping the other day about what stories about my research can I tell you that are safe to tell. So this is a story about a guy at Nantung. Accidentally, no, not accidentally, in about 2015, Mabel Lee was editing a book on Lushan in Australia. And she said to me, you have to write a chapter for this book. I said, I know nothing about Lushan, which is true. So she said, make it up, write something fictional. So I thought to myself, well, you know, the big mystery about Lushan is there's 2 months at the end of 1926 where nobody knows where he went. He had been in Xiamen, got fed up with it, and then he ended up in Zhongshan University for a while, and then he went various other places. Anyhow, nobody knows what happened. The odds are he was off having an affair with somebody in Lushan, but, and I don't want to blacken the man's name, that's just the way it was. But I thought, well, nobody knows where he was, so why don't I make up a story about him coming to Australia and meeting the Chinese communities here, and I will use it as a device to explain about Chinese in Australia. And actually, I read it the other day to make sure I wasn't mad. But it's actually quite a good piece. And it's well worth reading if you haven't read it. But the problem was, all the Lushan scholars in the world, I mean, I put clues into the article about how a mad retiring Chinese professor had found these documents when he was leaving, when he was retiring. I put a note at the end about how the author had met Lushan in 1968 when he was a student in Manchester, and all that stuff. You know, the Met being, I just encountered his writings kind of thing. Nonetheless, I got into trouble. Loads of people in the Chinese community here and in China started saying, if Goodman has these documents, why hasn't he made them available? Otherwise he's a fraud. And there's an article in the Australian Chinese press about it. Anyhow, so I'm in Suzhou, and this guy from Nantung contacts me. Come and have a meal, give us a lecture. So I go. He's a literature professor. And I give a lecture on something else. And then he takes me to lunch and says, I want to know about these documents. So I said, I tried to explain to him what I had done. He wasn't having any of it. He really wasn't. He wasn't then. He wasn't later. And he keeps writing to me, asking me for the documents. So one of the things I love doing in Suzhou in particular is going around the villages. The water villages, you know, it's not just Suzhou which has water, it's all these wonderful villages around it. These are just some examples of my favourite places and pictures. And of course, Lake Taiyuan, is very much part of Suzhou's existence. Suzhou's on Lake Tai, as well as in its own environment. This picture here of Suzhou Bay is really quite interesting. Jiangwansun is called Jiangwansun because it's at the meeting of two arms of the Grand Canal. And it goes into Lake Tai, of course. But Suzhou Bay is fascinating, and this picture is fascinating. Under where I'm taking the picture from, for 34 kilometres, is an empty city, underground. It was built during the 1970s in case the Russians invaded. Very seriously. They didn't, over the top was agricultural land. And they, you know, for a long time nothing was being done there, and so on and so on. They've just started to redevelop it, and a number of universities are now moving into the area. And they are going to use the underground areas too. Fascinating. Great sighting, by the way, because it's just flat, you know, straight down the side of the lake. And then two favourite places to end on, two favourite places in Suzhou. Zhongshan will be familiar to you all as where Sun Tzu lived and wrote Sun Tzu Bing Fa, The Art of War. And this is the monastery on top of the hill where he lived. And I really like walking there, it's great fun. And then this is Zhouzhuang. Zhouzhuang itself is a terrible tourist trap. But when I cycle around the villages, as I have often done, of a weekend, sometimes twice or three times in the week, I would always go out early in the morning and have breakfast of yotia, greasy stick, wherever I was. And I have to tell you, the best yotia in the whole of Suzhou region are these two guys. That's my bike, by the way. So there you go. And on that note, if you don't mind, I'll stop. Is that did I do it in enough time?
Oh, thank you so much.
That's okay.
When you mentioned you
That made you cough?
No, my mouth waters.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Take a seat. We must have a short conversation.
Oh, must we? Okay.
The David has so much adventure in China, and it makes me feel like I want to go back to trace his way. He's a lot more adventurous than many of us who actually grew up in China. And one particular place that he went, that's actually my birthplace, Shanxi, Taiyuan. And I was only there for 1 month, so never actually, till today, I haven't been back. So it's really great to hear that he knows so much about my birthplace than I ever imagined. So I also want to do this short conversation because, as you can see, that David knows so much about China. So I want to maximize a bit more and then to get to know a bit more about what he knows about China. So first, the short question is, you took so many photos before and after, you know, especially 30 years later. When you took first time, 30 years before, you took a photo, were you thinking 30 years later you will come back, you mark that place?
So, as you probably know, I'm an inveterate time traveller. And I got my DeLorean ready in the future, and I knew where I was going to be.
Oh, that's amazing. Anyway, so, you know, Suzhou, I've been to Suzhou, but I didn't actually know there was a red light district. So,
Well,
so you know a lot more.
That's because you're not a local.
No, exactly. So,
I think somebody else said to me today they didn't realise there was a red light district
Yeah.
anywhere in China.
yeah.
Oh, come on, get real.
Oh.
Get
Tea
real.
house especially.
I mean, it's only been a red light district for 1,000 years. Is it going to change? No, of course it's not. People make money out of it. We're talking Chinese here, you know?
Yeah. So my questions are completely different from what he has just told us. And the first question, because you started very early on and Chinese, you learned the Chinese language. And this question I found quite interesting because I found many people have very strong view or interest in this. So when you learned Chinese, did you learn simplified Chinese or traditional Chinese? And what's your view on the two different versions?
I don't have a view on the two different versions. I mean, I learnt complex characters, and then I had to learn simplified characters. The reason I learnt complex characters was because that's what I was taught at the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is not exactly, and certainly wasn't then, the most progressive teaching institution in the world. But that was, you know, that was 1970. If I'm in places, I mean, it's very useful to have both. In particular, you can't read Dards about wall posters unless you know the relationship between the two characters, because so much of what's in handwriting is from the full character, not from the simplified character. So, I mean, I think it's very, very important if you've got any kind of anthropological mien at all that you know full characters. But, you know, you can't expect, if we're going to educate people to learn to read and write, let alone speak Chinese, we really have to, we don't need to take shortcuts, but we have to understand that there's a layered hierarchy of education. So, yeah, okay, teach them to learn simplified characters first, but impress on them that they also need to learn complicated. So, I'll tell you my own story here. When I started, I thought I didn't need to learn classical Chinese or anything about classical Chinese. I was doing Chinese politics. Why would I need classical Chinese? I annoyed the professor of Chinese very much by saying that. But within a very short period, I realized I was wrong. You can't, if you're going to be serious about understanding Chinese culture, you have to know, not just simplified characters, but you have to know classical. And you have to know the meaning of Changyu and Shofar and all kinds of
So true, so true. Especially traditional complex characters. they actually carry a lot of the meaning, how the words means actually depends on the strokes. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, of course, the other thing is, in simplified Chinese, the same character can represent different characters in full, and that's mind-blowing. So, Lanzhou of Lan, right? Well, that can be 3 different characters. It makes no sense in simplified.
Well, if you ask my children, because they learned a bit Chinese when they were little, and then their names, the Chinese name, they always complain there are too many strokes, and that's a simplified Chinese already.
Well, that's okay, but that's children. That's children.
Yes, that's
when they grow up, they'll realise they need Goodman.
Yeah, no. Okay, talking about politics, the Chinese politics in China, which you actually studied and published many books on it, and then including handbook of politics of China. And you've also been conducting continuous researches in provincial and state leadership system. So my question is on your experiences, having this thorough and in-depth knowledge of various levels of governance in China, do you think it helps you navigating your way in China?
No, not at all. What you really need is patience, pragmatism, and the ability to help people. You don't need to know anything about the political system at all.
But that's actually the summation is coming from your knowledge of the system, don't you think? That's why you need...
I don't think my specific knowledge of local government helps me anywhere, really. Didn't help me here, doesn't help me there.
Oh, okay. All right. My next question is, you have obviously a wide range of interest in China, Chinese culture, history, and literature. And literature is one of them. You actually translated Meng Ke's poetry in 1981. So I want to ask if you can list one Chinese writer who had impact on your understanding of China.
One Chinese writer?
Yeah, you list one. So I'm sure there'll be many. We only need note.
I really can't do that because at different stages in my development, different writers, it's like if you asked me to name one writer in English, I read about 3 fiction books a week. If you asked me to say in English, who could I nominate in English, I couldn't do it because you read, you learn, you develop, and you go on. Who's my,
you can
writers.
Nominate a different stage. We all have, writers that influence us at different stages.
I can't do that. That's too hard. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I don't know how to even start answering that question.
Just to give an example, there are, when we were young in studying English in China, so we read mostly 19th century novels because that were available to us.
Yes, but
so,
I'm largely, I didn't study Chinese literature in China. I'm largely self-educated, just by sitting down and reading books because I prefer to read books than to watch television.
Yeah. Which book did you read?
Oh.
That has lasting impact on you? That you would remember?
Everything starting with Shui Huan, Sangguo, Shui Hu, all the classics, all the modern classics. Far too much.
Okay. All right. Anyone who grew up in China, knowing that when I was in high school, I now wanted to be a textile factory worker, and so that I could one day become a model textile factory worker. So one day I could be on television. So that was my dream. My mom said, no, you have to go to university. So all 4 of us siblings went to university. So you have worked in at many universities in China for many years. In your view, why, Chinese people and Chinese society attach so much importance to education? From early childhood to high school to tertiary education and to overseas education.
I'm sorry to be crass, but I think the answer is that the deference to Chinese education is part of the Chinese tradition and history. And, you know, what is Chinese culture without learning to read, write, and be educated? And I think, you know, that extends into the modern era. So I noticed, I forget what the figure was, just under 60% of the age cohort going from secondary school to higher education in China announced it in the government work report this year. That's a phenomenal number, much higher than the USA, much higher than here. It's an amazing achievement, even if you think that in China today that higher education includes not just university but also further education and vocation. Even so, it's a huge number. There's a privileging of education, and it's a lesson for the rest of the world, frankly. It's a good idea. I mean, luckily, not everybody has to be a Confucian gentleman these days, but nonetheless, it's a good thing.
Because you were involved in quite a lot of the international education. Do you think international education has changed China?
Wow. No, actually, I'm not sure it has. I think many Chinese who've been overseas, when internationalization when it became possible for Chinese students to go overseas, at first, many went overseas and stayed overseas. But subsequently, of course, many have gone back, and what they've done is they've taken their knowledge and their way of looking at the world back with them, but they haven't implemented it in whole. They've created a new synthesis of knowledge between what is China and what they're bringing back from wherever they come. In some cases, of course, like the University of Sydney, we are more Chinese than non-Chinese at the moment, so in terms of our student population. So it's very hard to say who's benefiting more or who's changing more from all this. But I think there are ways in which Chinese society has changed by being open to the world, but I don't think it's fundamentally altered those students' belief in the identity of being Chinese, which is good.
The other question I have is about class, because growing up, we often heard or used almost on a daily basis the phrase class struggle, 阶级斗争, which I never understood actually. It's quite abstract and fluid till today. I still don't have like a firm grasp on that, what is a class struggle. Anyway, so I would like to ask, these days the middle class in China is, people say, or is claimed to be the biggest or growing to be biggest in the world. So what do you see about middle class in China? Is it the same as middle class in Australia?
No. Do you want me to elaborate?
Yes, please.
Okay, so many places in the world, as soon as you say middle class, people think not middle class, but middle income. Okay? So what's middle income? Middle income is either 40 to 60% of percentile by income to the whole population, or 30 to 70. That's middle income. And in America, for example, they like to define middle class in income terms. But that's a very unsatisfactory way of judging what middle income is. Anthony Giddens and other sociologists these days, including, by the way, Marxist sociologists, have a different way of looking at it. They say it's not just about income, it's about income and wealth and inequalities of privilege in lots of different ways. And there are really three broad classes in society. Those the upper class who take the decisions of economics and politics, they're the upper class. There's the working class who are the manual labourers. And in the middle, there's a middle class who are the ones who have their position to service the state and society by virtue of their knowledge and skills and education. Now, if you take that approach, in China, the middle class, just to start off with, are definitely not the middle income. Way not. I mean, it's about 20% from the top only. So 80% up of percentile income are middle class. The middle class in China is still really the poorer cousins of the ruling class. That's all. I mean, not that's all, but that's what they are. And it's much smaller than people say. Of course, if you go and ask a business consultant, how big is the middle class in China? Because you want to do business there, they'll tell you, oh, it's going to be 700 million soon, because they're trying to sell you something. But effectively, in terms of decision making, and in terms of skills, and in terms of, even in terms of consumption capacity, it's not that big. So, you know, you've got your entrepreneurs, your serious entrepreneurs, not just your individual business people. You've got your intellectuals, you've got your government officials. That's the middle class in China. Largely the Taiyuan people, inside the system people, with a few outside, but not much beyond that. So I'd say 20% at most could be defined as middle class. But I'm an academic. I live in a university. I know that all concepts are contestable.
Very interesting. It's really good.
And if you're interested, you should read a book by David Goodman called Class in Contemporary China. Very easy to read and a delight.
My next or last question is about Deng Xiaoping. You wrote quite a lot about Deng Xiaoping, and including the Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese Revolution, a political biography. So I would like to know your view on Deng Xiaoping 25 years on after he died. Looking back and looking at the present, would you say that Deng Xiaoping has changed the path and the color of communist China?
Well, obviously he has. He did. Without either Deng Xiaoping or the people who were around him who made it possible at the time, the reform era probably wouldn't have happened in the way it did. The thing about Deng Xiaoping, which is crucial, of course, is his relationship to Mao. We know him as the person who started the modernization era, taking over Zhou Enlai's legacy and all that. But he wouldn't have been in that position if he hadn't have been. I showed you a picture of where he was during the War of Resistance in 1938. Why was he there? Most people, until people like me started researching, everybody thought he was with Mao Zedong in Yan'an. Well, he wasn't. He was there in Taiwan. Why was he there in Yan'an when he was a Maoist? The answer was Mao trusted him. Mao trusted him when he was General Secretary through the 50s, and right up until the Cultural Revolution, and even after the violent phase of the Cultural Revolution, he was allowed back because he was trusted. And he not only was trusted, but he had the networks of power within the party and army that nobody else had. So that, after Mao died, they could bring him back. He'd been criticised in April '76, as again you saw, but he was able to come back, and in fact they begged him to come back. They wanted him back. They were preparing it all the way along. Ye Jianying had him under lock and key in the south, so that he was safe for 18 months before he even started really getting quite active. And everybody, people had worked with him in the base area, in the party. He was Mao's man. He was everybody's man. Was he limited? Yes, he was limited, and that's why in 1989, his attitude was very clearly, these young people should know their place. They can't tell the party what to do. So, there's that. There's both sides of him. A party man and also a modernizer. I don't see anything wrong in that paradox. I mean, what are you going to do if you're a Communist Party leader of China, frankly? That's what you're going to do.
It's a fascinating answer. So that's why we would like to know all your views, but short of time, so we can't go on further.
Look, but you can tell people to read my book.
Yes, of course. But it's even more interesting to hear you say it. So anyway, so last small question. You're going back to China. You haven't been back for 3 years.
No.
2 years.
I've only been here for 2 years.
Oh, okay.
I was in China until March of 2021.
What do you miss the most?
cycling without having to worry about traffic in Sydney. I miss the food. The food, Chinese food. My favourite, what I'm really looking forward to, is I've booked myself into a hotel which is next to my favourite Buddhist restaurant in China. They make the best vegetarian food in the universe. I've been to Alpha Centauri, I know. And that's one thing, the food, the people, just the excitement of China. China, I think China's probably got under my skin in lots of different ways, but there isn't a single China, you know? Chengdu is exciting, it was exciting in the 70s, it stayed exciting. Xi'an is exciting, all the places I've been. Every place in China has its own story. I'm not an anthropologist, but every place in China. And I told you a lot about Suzhou, I've told you a lot about Shanxi, Chengdu, where every place. These are lots of people doing lots of things with history. What do you miss in Australia? There's no bloody history. I mean, there is a history, of course, and the history of First Nations is very interesting, but it's not the same as the, this is not a comment against First Nations, but First Nations were not civilized in the sense of the meaning of civilization, which is living in towns. Whereas Chinese civilization is about living in towns and hinterlands and rural areas around towns. That's what Chinese is about, going back to before there was a Suzhou, right? Suzhou only started in 541 BCE and only became famous in about the 6th century, or started to develop properly in the 6th century. But other places have been, Taiyuan hasn't been there very long. It got, where you were born.
Yeah.
Taiyuan is a fairly recent development in Shanxi, the capital of Bingzhou, the capital of the old Shanxi, was 30 kilometers away on the Fanhe River. It got destroyed when the Ming came to power because the people who were living there opposed the Ming, so the Ming wiped the city out and set it up somewhere else. So this is a fascinating history. This is a fascinating country with lots of different stories. And how there is, for me at least, there is no end to how fascinating it can be. And I hope you pick that up too.
Well, you've ended the story so well, and we can go on, but we can't. Thank you so much. Give a round of applause to Professor David. Wonderful. Thank you so much.